Testing, testing.
Hello, Bob.
Hey, Bob, can you hear us?
I can hear you now. The great Oz can listen and see you all in the land of Emerald City.
Oh, Lord.
Well, it is eerie, Austin. I can see the big head above everybody, you know? But I'm glad it works. How's everybody doing this evening?
We're here and present. All right.
Good.
We ready? Do I really have to do the gavel? Here, I'm just gonna call the meeting to order. I know. I could also use my big girl voice too. Or I could bust out my teacher voice. Y'all don't really want to hear that. All right. Was that? I do want to hear it. No. My nice one or my like, y'all need to get it together? All right, I would like to call the Marvin Planning Board meeting of May 16th, 2023 to order. We have a quorum, and Bob is joining us via Zoom. Since we're on video, I guess I do not have to go through and name everyone that is here, correct? Okay, we're missing Will. All right. Adoption of the agenda. Has everyone had a chance to review the agenda? And are there any changes, comments, questions? All right. You got your serious glasses on now. We're ready to roll. All right. Could I have a motion to approve, please?
So moved.
A second? And all in favor? Aye. So moved. Adoption of the previous minutes. Anyone have any changes, comments, questions on those?
No.
And if anyone would like to make a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So moved. Do we have anyone signed up for public comment? I know we've got folks in the audience, but I think they're presenting, so. Okay. All right. Then we will move on. to our items of discussion. So discussion and recommendation of the Sage at Marvin Minor subdivision plat. Hunter?
Yeah, so if you guys recall, this was the property that you guys reviewed last fall or winter, I guess, that the sketch plan for it was the estates at Marvin Acres at the time. Basically, the developer, they are in the process. We have their construction documents, been reviewing them. It was for a 23-lot subdivision. 3 of those lots were the large 5-acre tract. The applicants basically requested to potentially minor subdivide those lots, and the remaining portion will still go through the construction document and preliminary plat phase for the major conservation subdivision. I don't love that they did it this way. I would have rather than do this first, then do the major subdivision. This doesn't impact their sketch plan. Yeah. This does not impact their sketch plan approval because the site plan itself for the major subdivision is not changing. It's not increasing density, none of that. So basically tonight, per our ordinance, you know, all final plats for minor and major subdivisions do go through the same process with first being planning board's review and recommendation. So this is just a minor subdivision to exclude those 3 larger tracts. It's still the same. The lot lines are still the same of what was in the sketch plan and what their construction documents. If this gets approved by the council, I am going to hold off on signing it and having the mayor sign it as well, because I want to make sure that the developer understands that this could change some of their site plan stuff for their major subdivision, because our requirements of, you know, common open space, view shed buffer, any other stuff with state permits with sedimentation, erosion control, and stormwater, you know, I want to make sure that they know basically if any of that stuff in their construction documents, which as of right now does not have any of that on these 3 properties, but as long, you know, if they're going to have to utilize those 3 properties, then it will have to be included through the major subdivision. But
Can you say that again? I think I was thinking something along
So,
those lines, and then you...
basically, like, the minor subdivision portion's not a big deal. I mean, all 3 lots conform with our ordinance, straightforward. But since there is a
Sorry, the minor subdivision,
for the 3 lot, it would be a 3-lot minor subdivision, and to create 3 new lots, I guess, per se. And that 4th lot, the parent tract, is will be remaining of the 20, I think it's 27 acres.
and before you move on to the inner part, why would they not be applying for a rural subdivision?
Because
For
this
those-
is,
For those lots, because they're on 3 acres or more, correct?
because the rural subdivision's a hybrid of a major minor. This still complies with the minor subdivision. It's more abbreviated process. The rural, they would have to still go through the same process of getting construction documents and all that other stuff. So
Okay.
it's kind of like I said, this is basically breaking out those 3 large lots from the conservation subdivision that has been reviewed and approved and letting it be.
But doesn't those 3, don't the larger lots allow for the inner part to be conservation? I mean, like, if you're taking those, if you're moving that and making it a separate parcel, do they even have enough land?
I've done
on
the
leftover
acreage breakdown, and it does not to my, like, basically because the ratio is like 0.87 something times the number of lots. So it would be 20 lots on 28 acres, and they would have 8 acres of common open space. Because the common open space, if you guys look at the attachment in that master site plan, has 4.5 acres of the right side of that, and then 3.5 in that view shed area. So based off of that, they would still comply with the conservation subdivision part of our ordinance. But that's why, as I said, if the minor subdivision even, you know, goes through the approval process, I'm not going to sign it and have them record it until we check every box, and make sure that they know their liability. Like, if they do the minor and something doesn't work out with their major, then they'll just have to start that process all over again to develop that 28 acres that's left.
So that 4.5 is not included in the 3-lot minor subdivision?
No, it's remaining on the larger parent tract.
That's helpful, thank you.
Do you have a question?
Are we allowed to ask why? I'm just
can't-
curious, like, you go through all of this, or like, do you have any idea, like, you go through this whole process, right, and you go through all these phases, and then you decide to pull the three, like, pragmatically, I'm genuinely just trying to understand
Those
why you would
three-
change the idea.
Those 3 lots were always intended to be the lots for the investor slash the group. Basically, it comes from loans and debt issued on development from banks. Basically, instead of issuing debt on all 43 acres, they would only be doing it on 28 acres. Because that is where all the infrastructure would be installed anyway, all of that. So, yeah. Yeah, and so basically what this does is because the 3 lots, the existing home was always to remain, still is going to remain. So the new kind of 2 created lots have road access. There is already a platted or deeded driveway easement that kind of runs through the middle. And basically, the reason why I'm kind of okay with this is that, let's say it falls through with the 28 acres. Then these 3 lots still have access, still could be built, individual home sites, and then that 28 acres is what it is.
So wait, are you saying that what is Lot 21 and Lot 22, they're going to have main access onto Marvin Road?
I'm saying that if the overall larger development falls through, then yes, because there's already a platted driveway easement through, yeah.
For 21?
If you guys look at the minor subdivision plat in the packet, you can see
Yeah,
that,
So,
that access easement.
Yep.
And that's already on the property.
I think that was granted to the property owner prior to the new owners.
Correct.
So it's
So
just
it,
an easement, so they could have a driveway
So there's
off
nothing
of
right
it.
now, so
And
there's
it,
no cut in or anything right now?
no, it aligns with the people across the street that have
402, I
the
think
sand
there's a-
volleyball pit.
Yeah.
I don't know who they are, I just call them the volleyball pit people, so, that's a technical term.
Yeah, yeah,
So it aligns with their driveway.
I gotcha.
It still would be really kind of dangerous, so I'm
Absolutely.
surprised.
Okay, and then Lot 23 would tie into that same easement?
correct.
Okay.
And like I said, that is if the 28 acres does not develop. Because the intent is still to have the interior road network of the larger subdivision have access for that. Like I said, from my understanding of what the developers told me, it's taking these 3 lots out of their kind of what they would issue on debt, and the full scheme or common plan of development in that original sketch plan is still kind of falling through. Like, it's just, this is how they choose. So I don't love it. Like I said, I wish this would have been something they would have done first. But I've talked to our engineer and the attorney about it, and it's not the best way to do it, but there's nothing that they see concern, because like I said, we've reviewed the construction documents. It was originally going to be on the agenda tonight, but I told the applicant, I said, I can only do one or the other, because now, now the construction documents have to be revised to kind of reflect if this goes through.
But they are still maintaining a lot of the trees and land around the property, on the outside of the property, as well as potentially donating.
Yeah, that's
land
one, in my memo, I think I
for
mentioned that.
roundabout, So,
They will have, I've already sent these comments back to them, but basically, and I'll show you my little sketch, they will need to go ahead, because our ordinance requires it, is put the view shed on all the lots, because our ordinance requires it. So like, it's not, if you look at the master plan, it's platted that way, but on the minor subdivision, those 3 lots do not have that. They'll have to plat that for tree preservation and view shed purposes. But that's really one of the changes that they'll have to do for this minor subdivision.
So since those other ones, though, those 3 lots become a minor subdivision? Okay.
technically a rural minor.
A minor is just defined as, if you're not creating more than 4 new lots, all those lots comply with the regulations in the ordinance with road frontage, minimum lot size, yada, yada, yada. All of that checks the boxes, so. And for the most part too, the ordinance also stipulates, like, the reason why I said I wish this was done first is because the ordinance says, and this is basically if you have a minor subdivision and then you can't subdivide it further after that original one, or at least for like 5-10 years, everything changes. But if it does, if they wanted to, for example, put in a road and expand the public infrastructure, which is what they're in their major subdivision, it then has to go through the major anyway. So it's still doing that for that remaining 28 acres. Like, it's just, like I said, this is their kind of way of going ahead and getting that 15 acres per se of those 3 lots off of what they're trying to actually do.
Well, it's not ideal, but they can do what they need to do.
Yeah.
Are we voting on this tonight, or this is just a heads up?
No, you guys, I am asking for, I mean, you guys have to make a recommendation. Once again, it's just the way our ordinance currently reads with minor subdivisions, and all final plat approvals have to go through planning board for recommendation and council for approval. So staff recommends approval. You know, once again, there's stuff that I'm doing on my end once it gets through this process to just, once again, ensure that they're aware, all their stuff, I mean, so they can make their best decision, but this is just one way that they can do it, and there's really nothing that we can say. Like, basically, if they do this, the 28 acres remaining falls through, then that 28 acres would just, in a year anyways, would have to go back through a major subdivision process.
There is, Austin did put a vote language in eScribe under votes if anyone wants to make a recommendation, or if anyone has any questions before we
Just make sure your
do that.
microphones are on if you're making a motion or voting.
I do have one other question. So that easement would only be accessed if the 28 acres is not developed as part of as a minor
Correct.
subdivision?
That's one of the notes that I've already, basically that access easement would be to serve those 3 lots only until such time there's potentially a different access. But it's not their intent, but I have to do it that way because if everything falls through, at least these lots have access one way or another.
Anything else? Do you want to voice what's going on in your head right now?
Well, no,
I can see your I can see your wheels turning.
right, well, no, I was just thinking that with one not being reliant upon the other, right, we may end up with, I would just think that that horseshoe setup, right, like having a developer that's willing to take that, I mean, like, it just gets then more horseshoed, right, with the land that's left if these things do not
Well,
pan
like I
out, and we have no control over that. Like, we never actually have any control over that, but that's what was going on in my head, which is, the bottom line is they are following the rules that we have set forth, right? And so that's, our job is really just to make sure that people follow the rules that we have set forth. So I guess with that in mind, I don't know that we have any other option than to recommend approval of the minor subdivision plan contingent upon the applicant adding the ordinance requirement on the plat.
We have a second.
Not that I like it, but I think that's where we're at.
And all in favor? All right, so moved.
Like I said, I will just mention to that point that these lots are configured to how it would be tying into the major subdivision anyway, but it's. We don't know that it would become a subdivision next, though. Correct, but.
And we don't have any control over any of these things, really, but.
Yeah, because all these lots are conforming with the ordinance.
Even further limiting the opportunity.
Said, I don't love it, and this is a decision as them as property owners that they have to make on which route to go.
All right, moving on to the I can't talk today. The P's were just tripping me up. Preliminary review of the CZ 2023-1, the ZEPSA rezoning submittal of the White property.
So I think I've mentioned this to you guys at the last meeting, but the village has received a rezoning application for the former Scott White property. As most of you guys know it, it's the 1.5 acre tract that's just right beside the Crane Store property. There's an existing home on the subject property. The applicant has submitted their application. They have held their first public involvement meeting. Those minutes are in your included in your packets. The next step is they have the opportunity to present to planning board for preliminary review and discussion. You guys are not taking any action tonight on this. Basically, this is in short, a private public involvement meeting specifically for the planning board. It is an opportunity to ask questions, opportunity to provide recommendations, and discuss with the applicant on their proposal. Nothing is binding. But after this step, the applicant will hold their second public involvement meeting, which is June 6th, is what June 6th. After all that, then it will begin the normal recommendation process. So most likely this will be back on your guys' agenda for discussion and consideration starting at the June planning board meeting. Similar to how the Jones Homes went last year, it's basically on the same timeline. So without that, or unless there's any questions on the process itself, I'm going to turn it over to the applicant to present the site plan and their vision and go from there.
Good evening. My name is Suzanne Todd. I'm an attorney with Johnson, Nelson, Hord in Charlotte, and I'm here on behalf of the applicant Zepsa Capital. And our request is to rezone this property that Hunter mentioned from residential to commercial only, in accord with your Heritage Small Area Plan. So I want to talk to you just for a minute about Zepsa Capital and who is Zepsa. And we do have a PowerPoint presentation that we did include with your packet. I don't think we need it, so we're just going to talk about it real quick. Well, if you don't know Zepsa, they're an award-winning national metal and woodworking company. They've got an international reach, but their headquarters are in Charlotte, and their roots, well, they're in Marvin. The founder, Ed, and his wife, Mary Pat Zepsa, have lived in Marvin for over 20 years. And their children, their sons, Brian and Peter Zepsa, were raised here, and their children are being raised here, so this is their hometown. And they told me when they saw that the White property, they saw the for sale sign, they jumped on it. They moved quickly to get it under contract because they see this as a great opportunity for both the community and to leave a legacy for their family. So we are excited about this presentation tonight. Again, Hunter has talked about this property. Just want to hit the highlights that, again, it's located at 9908 Newtown Road. It's flanked by the church and then the little Crane general store on the other side. It does have the old Crane house. How old is that house?
I think it was built in 1906.
1906, a little house on it in the front. And it backs up to walking trails and open space, and then beyond that, a couple residential lots in the Preserve neighborhood. So as far as the vision goes, and I think one thing is to understand Zepsa, yeah, I'm a very visual person, and I ask them to provide me with a rendering of what this project would look like if you were standing on Newtown Road. And what the client produced was a 3D model that you see here before you, and even built
I'm sorry, overachievers. Just put that out there.
I mean, I was really impressed. And then, built the table on which it sits. So I'm going to ask, we've got a couple other people in the audience. We've got Brian Janess, he is our site designer. And he's going to talk a little bit more about the project and how everything all fits together and talk about his site plan. We are, it's really more of a sketch plan. We're working on the site plan, and we've got a lot of challenges on this property, so we're trying to address those and kind of work through everything so we can have it ready to be submitted in June. In addition to Ed and Peter and Brian, we also have Tom West, who's our civil engineer. So we would really value any feedback, good, constructive criticism, anything we can do, any thoughts you might have. We would really value that at the conclusion. Thank you so much. And I'll Vanna White for you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Genest. I'm a land planner and landscape architect, and as a former planning board member for the town of Davidson, I very much appreciate what you do and your role in all of this, so thanks for that in advance. Before we talk about the site plan, I did want to tell you, I don't mean to stand in front of you guys, but I did want to tell you, we've actually looked at the bigger picture as recently as 30 minutes ago back in the other room. So this really is a piece or the first phase of this larger area that you're talking about. And I know we're not looking at rezoning the property next door, but it is meant to be part of something much larger, okay?
Piecemeal, what was your quote, the quilt, patchwork of a quilt for the Heritage District? Back when we approved the language? Yeah, it was,
Well, it is part of the bigger quilt, but if you said it, that's really good. But yes, I just want, again, we're talking about planning issues here. This is really much bigger than what we're talking about today, and hopefully it's the beginning and the catalyst for a lot more to come. So we'll really start, I guess we'll really start with the site plan, and as Suzanne said, it really starts with the old house. And the first piece to say is the old house that sits right there at the front, built in 1906, is going to be preserved and restored and renovated like you probably can't imagine, because these guys do amazing things, and I would encourage you to look at their website. So that's the first building here, and we're going to talk about the site plan. And because that house is located where it is, of course, it sets us up for the parking to come this way, okay? So you can see we have parking. In addition to that, there is a small building planned behind the house that will be ancillary, because the hope is that this will become some kind of a restaurant or tavern, and that could be the kitchen. And according to Ed, they do not want to destroy what's happening on the inside, so that would necessitate this piece right here, which more than likely would be the first phase. Then there would be a second building, and eventually there would be a third building. And in keeping with your ordinance, we'd park as much as we could to the back or to the side, given its shape. And then there's, which is not shown here, we now have a survey. There are quite a few large trees. There's a beautiful magnolia we'd like to save here. There's a 30-inch oak tree that we'd like to save. There's a lot of existing, there's a beautiful tree here that can be preserved. So there's a lot of vegetation. And we've kicked around names like Marvin Grove, for example, to really pay respect to what's going on here, okay? In addition, we do have a power line that we're have to pay attention to. There's a 30-foot buffer here that's going to play into the setbacks that are also talking about. So although it's only an acre and a half, there's really a lot going on here. I wanted to show you, here's an image of the side of the building. So it would be as if you were standing here, looking to the side. This is the existing, and this would be that addition that I was talking about. Ed and his kids are really, really interested in architecture, or at least Ed, for sure. And so one of the things we talked about is this building was probably part of a farm. And in a farm, there are a lot of different types of buildings. And there could have very well have been a barn. So one of the thoughts is perhaps this building could take on the appearance of something that could be sort of barn-like. Again, none of this is completely resolved, but it's just some thinking. The third building, which is the one in the back and will be a real focal point coming in off of this street, maybe that building takes on a little bit more character like these houses. And these are buildings that have been in the area. I don't know if this one still exists. This yellow house, is it still standing? Okay. It's in Mecklenburg, okay. So you can see the idea is to have things fit together, but maybe look a little bit different as when they could have been built at different times.
Yeah, think Baxter Village instead of Ballantyne Village, more of a eclectic mix.
Right, and there's some great buildings at Baxter Village, how they all look kind of different. And again, it's like a town would be built. towns aren't, unless it's Birkdale Village, are built all at once, and that's really what they're thinking. They do it in phases, and they would also build them so that they look like were built over time. So, Suzanne, is there anything else that we want to add? I mean, you're welcome to come up and look at this more closely, but as Suzanne said, we very rarely get to see a model of what it really would look and feel like, much less have it built with a beautiful structure like this to sit on. So I think this is really helpful in giving you a sense of scale. And, you know, we're talking about two-story buildings. We are talking about, you know, maybe a few revisions to what's happening, especially along the backside as it relates to the buffers. We are proposing a stub to connect over eventually to this parking lot right here, a stub to a potential parking lot perhaps behind the church, a stub over to the Crane property, as we understand that that will redevelop. So again, it's the beginning of a lot to happen over time. And we really hope for this to become a very lively, active place where the community can gather, as I think is your vision. Oh, and this right here, you can see there's a lot of open space around this building. This is about 40 feet right here. So there's all this open space. There's this sort of promenade area. There's all this space. That's about 30 feet in there where we could have tables and chairs and places for people to gather. You know, maybe even some of this gets closed off if there's a really big event. So there's just a lot of great things that we think could happen for the community, and we're so fortunate that these folks live here and care so much about it. So, if that's...
What I love about this is when you drive in Newtown and then you turn in here, you've got this gorgeous, stately, like manor-type building in the back, and then you've got these other buildings kind of situated along. It just makes a really, really majestic view.
Yeah, feel free to take a walk around. Yeah, the view from Newtown is right here.
So, I have questions, but I can look at this and then go back to my microphone. All right.
Unless you want wireless.
Sure.
Like you said about Baxter Village, this looks very much.
Actually, that's a great picture of that building at Baxter, that's model, right?
Oh, the back.
I know, we gotta,
We're doing some back elevation drawings right now, and we'll be submitting those later. They won't be great, but they'll be simplified. They'll be, you know, also, we're thinking that these will be offices on the second floor and retail spaces on the first floor.
But it's not going to have the porches and everything on the back. I mean, you don't want
No.
people leering into the neighborhood
Well,
beyond,
no,
you
and
know.
it's, and it,
We're trying to keep people in this area.
yeah.
This is parking, this is the walking trails back here, so this is the general area here up to the front by the old Crane House and whatnot.
I did want to mention, we are preserving right-of-way for the Marvin Loop here, and a connection to, there's a greenway path behind us for public access.
so one of my questions is actually about parking. So I read in the packet that we received that while the tavern is not necessarily completely fleshed out, you were looking at like a seating of like 70 to 90 people, but the parking doesn't really, I mean, if you say worst case scenario, you know, 45 cars, right? That's a lot for one building. It'd be fine if there was nothing else, but if there's also retail going on, like what is really the parking situation?
So there are approximately 60 spaces here, and so there is there's approximately 60 spaces here, and our hope and plan, it's parked at about 3 to 3.5 per thousand, which is an okay number for the kind of place we're doing. But our hope is, some people that come to places like that now Uber. It's very common for folks to Uber. We're also hoping there's a parking lot across the street. You know, there's that gravel lot across the street. And granted, they don't control it, but it's still there, and they are in discussions with the church on how that could perhaps be utilized. And, yeah, and there's
Well, that's where
all this.
sidewalks and the greenway connections come in.
And Peter, who lives across, we're hoping some people will walk with all these great greenway trails. And I know it's not all in place today, but the vision is over time, everyone wouldn't have to drive here like perhaps they do today,
You could park at the Ville. You can also, it's very walkable from the
from
Village Hall.
right here.
You can
kinda come-
easily walk up. But I don't-
See this as a small neighborhood, local, micro kind of village. You know, we don't see this as the kind of destination going to Valentine, for example, or driving to, you know, whatever. Yeah, we see people walking here, we see people riding their bikes here, we see teenagers.
Not staying too long.
Well, I'm just saying,
Families.
you know, teenagers that maybe don't have enough places to go to and get out of their bedrooms and off their screens and I know it's a radical thing, but actually maybe coming over there and hanging out with their friends at a coffee shop or something like that. So a very
Steady.
local place, and even if we had another 5 acres around it, I don't think that we would just create parking lots to create parking lots.
And, I mean, it's a valid question, and we always wrestle with the right amount of parking to building, and we never want to have more than we need, right? Because the last thing we need is more parking lots and more asphalt. So that number that we've used, I think we feel good, given all the things we've just talked about. You know, it's not a tremendous amount, but it's still not, it's not too little. Right.
And I'll
The tavern, is that what you're saying?
Right. Became very popular, and the old Yogi Bear saying that nobody goes there anymore because it's too crowded. And, you know, that's the concern because, you know, you want this to succeed, and I can guarantee you at first, when this opens up, you'll be inundated with people. And that's the biggest concern of where you're going to put it, because you don't want people to say, I'm not going there anymore, there's no place to park.
Well, the
you know?
early phase is easy, to be honest with you. When
Say it
just
again?
when this is built, there's all this land that could be parking. So it will, if this is wildly successful, then maybe we have to rethink how that is. And again, fortunately, there are options here. There's this right here, and they're in discussions with the church about even here. And maybe it's nothing more than a gravel lot, or it's grass. Yeah. But absolutely, that would be a great problem.
and I'll
Yeah.
And I'll add to, once again, like, I don't have a staff report because obviously they're still working on their final, I mean, they have a submittal, but kind of working through their final kind of application components. But the MHD form-based code does not have minimum parking standards. Does not have minimum parking standards, because the intent / kind of the new common practice for planning is that you used to have like a parking schedule of, okay, what you're doing, here's your minimum spots per square footage, depending on the use. But kind of to the point of like, well, some of that, then you have more parking for really what's needed, and then you have this empty parking lot. So it's, the practice is kind of now of like, okay, let's look at what they propose, and some of this can kind of go into their conditions of their approval or some of their recommendations into their site plan of what is really needed compared to having the ordinance dictate that.
I'm just looking at so your phase one, you'll come back to us with phase one, and you'll have that one building, and you're going to pave and stripe the entire.
No,
You're
not pave and stripe. What we would be doing is, if we need to provide parking, it would be graded so that it could be, but we wouldn't necessarily be building all the parking unless it became really necessary, right? We're going to probably, I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but I would think they would build this and maybe, you know, enough parking to accommodate to here, and then the rest of it could be overflow. Just have to study that.
As things go and evolve. Sure.
But, yeah, it's difficult because we're starting out, we're the first ones, and the idea and the vision would be that all of this eventually connects into a, you know.
But until then,
And right, we'd have to.
And this might be a question for you guys. I don't know if they're at the point yet, but because this property is so small, just in terms of acreage, and it's long, they won't have to do any type of retention ponds, stormwater drainage, containment?
We're already discussing that. Basically what the ordinance dictates is that their pre-construction flow, as in, runoff from stormwater, let me phrase that. Their post-construction has to meet what their pre-construction numbers were, meaning that even after they develop it, it still should meet what the pre-construction of stormwater runoff. There's ways that they can do that on site. There's ways that we're in conversation of trying to collaborate on all of that, because we're going through the same process with the Village Hall, with the potential amphitheater site, what we're dealing with currently. So we're having some conversations of trying to look at a regional type solution or a hybrid type approach. But all that stuff is bare bone, like we're in the early stages of trying to get that figured out. But that will kind of be figured out in the next month or two of the options that they have.
And I know that there was some concern about lights shining into the neighborhood, into the back, and obviously Phase 3 is quite a ways off, but what solutions are you guys kicking around right now to block?
We're proposing to put at least a fence along here that would block that, because we heard that in one of the community meetings. There's a 25-foot landscape buffer, but there'd be an additional fence to completely block it.
That's great, because it'll also help if we're talking about
Noise, too.
acoustics, and I know there's not supposed to be any outside noise, but, you get people having a drink or two, they go out to the parking lot, and some people are loud talkers.
Well, and as I said, there's also a 30-foot buffer that goes with the adjacent neighborhood. So at a minimum, we have 55 feet of landscape plus the fence. And this building is 125 feet from the residential property line.
And,
What's-
and it's brick, is that
Well,
what's,
at this point, it's shown, but that's yet to be determined.
okay.
But I think, there's discussion, you could move up the building, do things like that, but there are also some really beautiful trees in front, you know more about them.
Right here.
So we are trying to balance between losing these trees, trying to preserve significant, trees versus configuring the buildings around them.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah, to keep the trees and to keep especially, we have some, 2 or 3 foot oak trees.
Yeah, there's a 30-inch oak right there and a 22 here, 26.
The idea is to make this look like as mature of a little village as we possibly can, and keeping as many of the trees that we can, we think is important compared to, what is that over there?
Broadmoor.
What?
Broadmoor?
Well, Broadmoor was already, no, but the shopping center where the Publix is.
No, Marvin Gardens.
They clear cut, yeah.
Put up buildings, plant new trees.
Keeping a grove, right, Ed?
We're trying to approach this a little bit differently than that. But you asked about the brick. We're showing a brick front elevation on that Greek revival style building. We're likely going to maintain whatever is on the front elevation in terms of materials, keep them consistent on all 4 elevations, rather than, again, like where the Publix are, is, creating a front facade and then 3 sides of painted,
Cinder blocks.
concrete block.
You don't like that?
So we're trying to be sensitive. We really are trying to make this look as if, and Brian sort of explained it from front to back, but we're trying to make this look like, maybe this was a house where the original owner lived, at a Greek revival house, and it was a farming, rural, agricultural community out here, and maybe he had a caretaker's house in the front, and trying to create an environment that could be something that would be expected here in this area. folks who are Google us, you know, on Zepsa Industries, and we started out 40, 50 years ago now, almost, I can't even believe it, but started out a small little business with a small shop the size of this little area, and we built it a day at a time, a person at a time, and it's been successful for us, and it's been successful for us because we, you know, I thought I heard somebody say there's an overachiever or something, and maybe that's the case. You know, we care a lot. Sometimes we care too much about things, but at the end of the day, at the end of all of this, what you're really left with is just your legacy, the pride and heart that you put into things, and we want to bring that as a family here to this place that we call home, to this little place that we want to be proud of and build for this community here.
So,
Yeah,
stop there, yes, well, yes. So, as someone else who also grew up in Marvin, and it sounds like I may have been here a little bit older, but nonetheless, and who is also raising my children here, I have been incredibly vocal about, generally, I believe that we follow the rules, and thus, if you have followed the rules, you get to come forward and do the things, right? Voted against the Marvin Heritage District. I'm not necessarily for developing this because, well, when we were growing up here, it was quiet, right? I didn't have people running off through the fence in my front yard, et cetera. So, having said that, this is absolutely beautiful. Definitely don't necessarily love the idea of the development, not necessarily seeing this. Also can't afford to buy all the land in Marvin and just keep it the way that it is, so we have to go forward. This is absolutely stunning, and I personally could not be happier with what you all have done here. So that, as a fellow person who's also raising the next generation, our kids are probably going to school together. This is great. Thank you. Thank you for the passion and for wanting to help keep Marvin looking authentic.
All of us, a lot of us feel that way, you know, just keeping things as they were, you know, and is sometimes the dream of, but time goes on and the momentum to change is there and it's powerful and it's almost unstoppable. And so sometimes your next best thing that you can do from fighting to stop it is to at least do it right.
Develop it the way that it should be developed.
And so we said, look, you know, somebody's gonna do this, you know, because I was driving out of town and I think the sign must have gone up like a day early. And I called Brian and Peter and I said, listen, take a look at this thing. Because we had at one time wanted, and I don't know how it got away from us, we wanted to buy the little general store that's right next to it. And we didn't, and when my wife and I saw this, and a week later they had bought it, and or something, yeah, very fast, because I hate right here in the middle. I mean, we've already got two great things here. We've got two beautiful churches. You can't, as a developer, come in and fake churches, you know, to make it look that way. So we've got two beautiful little churches here and a cemetery, and there's a certain environment already going on here. You know, we said, let's see if we can jump on this and become part of this, and then let's try and do it right, because somebody's gonna do it, and I don't know who they are, I know who we are. And so we would like to, you know, if you guys permit us and everybody, you know, allows us to go forward with this, we'd like to do something really nice with this property. Yeah, it is small, but like Suzanne said, it's a catalyst for something much bigger, and we're hoping that we set a tone here. Exactly right. That for the next
That's what I was going to say.
however many acres are here.
You're setting the precedent by going first.
We've got 2 acres sitting right here, you know, that's gonna have to look something like this, and then another few right over here. It's not gonna be able to be, you know, something like what they're building over here to be right next to it.
Yeah, it's a very thoughtful design.
And it makes the job really, I think, if the tone is set right and everyone supports this tone, this sets the spirit and of the place.
I do have two small questions. One, with a tavern producing a lot of waste, I'm assuming that that's a little, trash recycling area in that corner there. I mean, I'm sure this is not going to be,
Yes.
is that enough for a restaurant and 2 office buildings, that area? Because it looks like it's just a
Probably, so
a
it depends
sketch,
on-
but, it looks
depends
like
on how many
not.
times a day, and depends on how often. More than likely it would. And again, we don't know what these uses will be. If they end up having more, then we'd have to make it larger, but we'll certainly make it commensurate with what's required and what's needed. 50 days? Yeah.
This all started maybe 4.5, 5 weeks ago, so this was really fast for us.
We're gonna try to, make design decisions with all of those kinds of things in mind. I mean, there's gonna be, 8 guys working in the kitchen that wanna go have a cigarette on the back dock somewhere.
They vape now. They don't smoke cigarettes. It's vaping. Which vaping is not allowed in Marvin. No vape shops, kids. Yeah, no vape shops. So they can vape on their own time.
All of those things have to still be figured out.
Yeah, I'm not even worried. I wasn't even worried about lighting. I did, and this is kind of nitty-gritty as well, and it might sound a little rude, but because you're taking such care with the trees, the property, doing this one building at a time, you're doing it the thoughtful way, not the inexpensive, get-it-done way. Is that going to affect your rents and who would potentially be able to afford to come in and rent or lease space from you guys?
Well, look, this, like I said, there's a different way to build this that would be very efficient in terms of producing a pro forma.
And we appreciate the direction you're going. I just want to make sure that, is it going to affect your rents to the point where, like, no one can afford it, so.
This will not be cheap space, okay? So somebody's gonna have to come in here and pay maybe a little bit above market, but I think they're gonna see this as being so unique and so different and so special, not just this property, but everything that's gonna go around here, this historic district. They're going to wanna get in there. This is our little Marvin Central Park. You know what I mean? And, because there's nothing else like that. And I think everyone's gotta be really, really mindful and careful of how we treat this last 5 or 8 or 10 acres, because you'll never duplicate this again. You can't go on Providence Road, you can't go on Crane Road and buy 10 acres and rebuild the history of what's here. All we're doing is really inheriting it in some way, even though we're paying for it, we're inheriting it. We're going to try to improve it, and we'll be gone before we know it, and our children, our grandchildren are going to inherit it next. And so I think people will want to be here, and will want to pay more. And if, and it's not much square footage. I mean, we're talking about a total of, 20,000 square feet? It's not like we're having to fill up South Park Mall here.
Right.
We're not a big development company. We don't have investors we have to answer to. We don't have, all that sort of stuff. This is it. It's the family. So, if the percentage of what you're gonna make at the end is a little bit less or whatnot.
And that's your business.
That's on us and everything else. We're not talking about 50% higher, or anything like that. But, I think we'll be comparable with some of the things. We've looked at what people are paying over here and over on 521 and all in downtown Waxhaw and all these different areas. We're not gonna be much higher than some of those rents that people are paying per square foot. But we're right in the middle of all of it here.
Were you asking if it would,
It was really,
economically viable?
right, yeah. I mean, and that was really just, when we first started down this road, one of the things we did talk about was, we don't want empty storefronts. We don't want, what's happening in the Stonecrests and, where it's like just a rotating, like a restaurant comes, like 3 months later, they're gone. You're like, where did my new? no, believe me, yeah, I know.
There's so little of this.
The numbers, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Plus, this is a very small project compared to a Stonecrest. You know, this is going to be a very unique village. I mean, I really, I was thinking about this. It reminds me a little bit of downtown Davidson, if you've ever been there. Waxhaw might be your model.
yes.
That's a very unique place. It's a very finite place. There's a list of people trying to get in there because it is so unique. It's not another strip mall. This is going to be the same kind of place.
And the rents in downtown Davidson are extreme.
They are high.
And there's a waiting list.
And there's still a waiting list.
And there's a waiting list, so I don't think.
But it wasn't always like that. So, I mean, this is going to be out of the chute like that.
And I have to back up what Melinda said. I'd rather drive by, see something beautiful like this than a big box. And this does fit into everything that Marvin is.
and, oh, no, I was just gonna say, I have a warehouse in Loso, and so I drive by your SEPSA project. And I was very jealous that you got that property, because I really needed a warehouse that was bigger. But you've done a lovely job restoring it. Ye-
So it was 31, 32 years ago, and it was sort of one of the shops we had, and that neighborhood back in 91, we were scraping, we're Chicago people, west side Chicago, and so we're used to neighborhoods that where the cops don't like to go even.
Well, it can still be a little scruffy sometimes, but it's changed a lot.
yeah, it's changed a whole lot.
Yeah, it was a pretty bad neighborhood. Now, of course, it's all changed and
And there's a pickleball court going in, because,
as it changed. But you're in Loso, is that what you just said?
my nonprofit is in the back of CBI on Yancey, across from Brewers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I drive past that little warehouse almost every day. Oh, you did? I knew I was like, I knew I recognized you. That's funny. Okay, anyway, sorry, we diverge. Huh? Oh, you're on? Yeah. Ding, ding. We squirrel.
You know, we're hoping that the tavern, and we are doing a tavern and a little pizzeria in that building.
Oh, okay.
On the end, we're just starting the interior design for it now. It'll be about 4,000 square feet. There's like 1,400 apartments going around that building, and we think we'll do well. We hope in the same way, if we open this place up here, and we won't be making pizza ourselves, by the way, but.
I don't know your last name. You could, you don't know.
What? Well, it's Rough Mill Music, the Rough Mill Tavern is one of them, the pizzeria is the Petty's Pizzeria, and we'll put somebody to run it, we just don't have the time to do that. But we're working with a guy out of Nashville and out of New York to develop the menus. Our idea is, and if you guys want to write us or email us on any ideas that you think would work great in terms of being out here, I'm with you, hoping that this place will just do really well, because there's really nothing around it. We want to have it very active.
This is 10 years in the making, so
Yeah.
people are ready.
Yeah, and, something in terms of the restaurant here might be, we've kicked around places like Crumpleton, if you know them over there, in the Elizabeth neighborhood, and,
Well, you do know that, the Stanley on 7th Street has closed its doors, and he started in Waxhaw, so he might be looking for a new home. And that Waxhaw, his old Waxhaw place was the #1 restaurant in Charlotte, being in Waxhaw, so
but,
you need
we
a,
plan to have good food and beer and good times, and maybe a little music venue once in a while on a weekend or something like that, and so we think it'll be a great gathering spot,
well, thank you, guys. We appreciate your passion and your thoughtfulness and your presentation, and we love overachievers. So it shows. Does anyone have any questions? And are we just?
Great first start. You're going to come before us at least a couple more times, so I'm excited to see the next couple of times you come before us. But thank you very much for your time and efforts.
They're waving at you, Bob. Wave back.
Yeah, hang on. I want to thank Zepsa Industries for really contributing to the community and the legacy you've done, Mr. Zepsa, enriching your family and making a legacy like you've done. I'm talking to you from Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut. When you get done with this, whole project, you need to come up here to Cornwall Bridge. It looks like Marvin in terms of prices and homes, but 40 years ago. And they're absolutely begging for entrepreneurs like you to come up here and to absolutely make the community. They're so in need of everything you're doing exactly right there. Just keep the same plan and come up here when you're done, okay? I'll keep you going. I'll keep you going. I'll keep you busy.
I don't have that much time to focus on what I got.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, we are moving on to the discussion and recommendation of the Marvin Heritage District Form-Based Code revisions. I have been told this is still kind of in process, so it's going to be more of a, I think, discussion. Hunter?
Yeah, so been working on, as we discussed last meeting, working on some text revisions, and this is kind of being derived by now having interest in some of these, properties. It's not just EPSA, but it's, talking with Fincher and his team, and even Ravi and all this, and how the ordinance currently reads and what's the intent, and like what really is it trying to do. So I've been working on a few texts. I'm gonna get it up here on your guys' screen. I'm not looking for a recommendation tonight. I'm looking for some feedback, discussion, direction on these proposed changes. And potentially, depending on the feedback and discussion tonight, we can potentially recess and I make the formal changes and have it back for the May 30th meeting, or bring it back to you guys for the June meeting, just depending on going through these. So first, kind of highlighted the areas. I put in your packets a version of the code. It's what was adopted. Basically, with conversations with our attorney, he went through and highlighted sections that probably need to be looked at, need to be thought about being revised just because of the way they read. And a lot of these changes are reflected in this. The first one being, I don't know if it needs to be in the applicability section, but the district's set up as a conditional zoning district. Most of the time, you have either a corresponding conventional district. We don't have that in this case, so it's like, these are the standards. This is what we set, and so on. Conditional zoning does allow for, the intents to allow for some flexibility of applying these standards to, certain properties. I mean, if you take the Zepsa property, it's narrow and long. If you take Ravi's property, it's wide and short and in depth. So, it's then really some of the parts of this ordinance, the way it was written, it wasn't really tested on how it would actually work. So the first one being the changes, basically allowing that if there's an opportunity, like basically if some of these cases arise like this, that the applicant or, has a right, or not saying that it's going to get approved or any of that, to propose to deviate from the ordinance, meaning if the setback's 50 feet and they're proposing 45 feet, it can be a part of their submittal. They would have to submit a deviation table saying basically every section that they're not complying with, what their deviation request would be, and what their justification is. That's what this is stating. It basically then states that they would have to explain in their submittal and, when they're presenting why they're asking for this and why, what they're doing to mitigate it. For example, if the buffer says 100 feet, they're requesting 50 feet. Their proposal is that they're going to do a screening fence, make it very opaque, dense, certain things like that. And I'm just using that as example. I'm not saying that's theirs. I'm just saying that's a potential example. So that's the first proposed change. Does anybody have any questions, heartburn on that? Because once again, it doesn't apply unless they are approved for rezoning. And this would be something, part of their submittal that kind of provides them flexibility to come to the table further. Because right now, that's what 2, 3 of the property owners are struggling with, is because they're trying to follow the code and it's the interpretation where it's like, it doesn't make sense. Any questions on that? Good. That's kind of, it's basically, because in the current ordinance, it states basically, these are the standards, these are what apply. That's it. So the typical with conditional zoning is like, you have a standard and you're not technically supposed to go less than the standard. This should also be on your guys' monitors in front of you. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'm proposing, right, the document that I've got pulled up is the proposed, like, the draft proposed changes at the current moment. Like I said, this is, yeah.
So why was the, I think, from what I was reading, the highlighted area in the document that you sent us,
Mhm.
are the areas that you either need to insert or edit?
Edit. Those were what was identified by our attorney, that when you really get into the applicability of it and kind of, like I said, a lot of that was in there when this was a conventional district before I started, and then we kind of switched it to conditional, that some of the language in that needs to change to reflect it being a conditional district. And a majority of those sections are kind of, like, it doesn't mean that that's going to change. It's as simple as like adding this one section right here kind of covers probably about 50% of those highlighted changes, because it just talks about process, approval, and what the standards and what can be submitted and kind of considered.
So this language, because I know that we get into like the table. Sorry. I know that when we get into the tables later, are you saying that this language basically is saying most of it stands, but if you need to deviate, this is just how you do it? Like if your property
You have a
does
right to
not-
propose it. It does not, once again, it's a
Right.
rezoning process. If, and I'm using this as an example, if somebody wanted to propose a car dealership, I don't know, like, yeah, they can do it. The likelihood of that getting approved, bare minimum. Because once again, even if that somehow would, like, it has to still be consistent with what's in the ordinance, what's in the small area plan, what's in the land use plan, like all of that. So it's just still, it's just kind of provided, it's the intent of this is to allow for minor deviations of the ordinance, nothing like way out there. So,
Once they're approved for adjustments.
well, they would do the deviations as a part of their submittal, and it would get approved with their submittal. But, yeah.
If we approve it.
And that, yeah, and that's the thing, is that they have to, every single property, when ready, like, for example, the Zepsa property, like, those deviations get compiled into the approval of just that development. Meaning, if you're allowing a buffer reduction on one property, does not mean you have to do it on the other unless the justification is there.
Okay.
So,
Thanks.
so the second major change is with special uses. Once again, this was one of those changes that was because when we had a conventional zoning district, we set some uses up as special uses, put some additional requirements on them. So the proposed change here, it's done in one of two ways. The first way that I'm going to go through is probably not the way that I'm going to do it, or would prefer to do it, and I'll explain why. But it's basically taking all special uses and allowing them as permitted uses with supplemental regulations. So that's what we kind of done with some in our normal ordinance for certain uses. It's basically the same requirements, but as long as they comply with those requirements, it never has to go through the special use permit approval process. When I did some further kind of research and stuff, I found a better way, I think, to do it. basically, and I'm gonna have to go to the end of the document here to show you what I'm proposing. But basically, it would keep all the special uses, all the same requirements, and sorry, get to this, if it wants to work for me. Basically, what this change is proposing is, if you're proposing a use, for example, ZEPSA was proposing a restaurant serving alcohol, which is a special use in the current table, that if that is part of their proposal and that it gets approved with that, then they do not need to come back and get a special use permit if that use is approved as part of their submittal. Get to the language here. It should be right. Okay, this is weird.
Or knowledge, I'm sorry, but that would have knowledge of who the tenant potentially could be. So you're saying that they would come to us saying, we know what the exclusions are, no vape shops, yada, 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 no strip clubs. But with a restaurant, we want to have liquor, so you're saying that they would include it now, at this point, even though that might not be a tenant. You're saying
Correct.
to
Since they're
pre-approve it.
proposing it, it's part of, it's their vision. And so what this language, and I don't know why, it's like, it's for some reason not,
You're talking about, are we talking about rezoning applications, or are we
Yes.
talking about rezoning and then this is when this would kick in?
see, it's supposed to be like right here, and for some reason it's just not here. So let me just read you the language. But basically, what it states, it's, in the administration, it says, certain additional approvals may be unnecessary, is the title of the subsection. It says, an MHD conditional zoning district approval will preclude an applicant from having to obtain a special use permit if the conditional zoning district application, as approved by the village council, includes uses that are classified as special uses in the table, in the permitted table. Basically, it says, if the village council determines that sufficient evidence is presented by the detailed review of the rezoning applicant submittal, and it says, additionally, an MHD conditional zoning district approval may preclude any applicant from having to obtain a preliminary plan approval for a major subdivision if the level of site detail is sufficient for review and approve. That's already a thing. Like when Jones Homes went through, like that was their sketch plan phase. They still have to go through the construction document phase. But what this is saying is that if it's a special use and they're proposing it as part of their vision, then that they don't have to come back and get a special use permit approval. Now, I'm gonna pick on Will, for example. His property, he might, because it's an existing home and not adding things, his vision's maybe not as detailed as ZEPS's. He wants to go through the rezoning process, he can, if he doesn't have like a specific use for that building. And then, if he gets approved for rezoning, let's say then he has a restaurant that wants to serve alcohol, then they would have to come back and get a special use for his property. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, and I know that you weren't, well, you were here when we approved this, but what is the point of a special use permit in the traditional sense? Because I kind of feel like, just saying, just in a sketch plan, just in the zoning process and the rezoning process, just saying, yes, you can do it, when there's really not a ton of information, you know what I mean? Like, we're not getting, like, that makes me a little nervous about giving a thumbs up and we really don't have any detail.
So with the reason it's a special use is because when this was being done as a conventional district and all properties were to be rezoned that, to become the heritage district before I started, then that special use was kind of the protection in place for some of these uses. Like, it's just an extra step in the process that they would have to come. But once again, it's a quasi-judicial approval for special use permits. Really, if they comply with those additional regulations, it's legally harder to deny. But if it's a part of a rezoning approval, then that's something that, like, once again, can influence potentially the legislative decision behind their approval or denial of the rezoning.
Do you think that in a rezoning application that we will be given enough information to safely approve it and not it won't come back to bite us if they tweak it, change it.
But
You know,
what
maybe
do you
it's like a
mean?
themed, I'll just pick on the Zeps for a second. Like they want to do a tavern. Well, in what they presented, it was very detailed. Like it was a good presentation. But like, what if they come back and they're like, we want to do a tavern, but it's going to be Dick's Last Resort. You know what I mean? It's going to be a chain tavern.
You can't discriminate on who the tenant or restaurant is. You're regulating.
Not even in a district where it's legally, okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, I was a bad example, but do you see what I'm saying? Like, we're not given a lot of information just for rezoning, and we're gonna say, yes, like.
You're approving the use, not the tenant.
Correct, and that's the same thing.
No, and
Even
I get that, but,
If they describe the use, they have to stick to that use.
yeah.
and will we have enough information on how the use needs to function? Will it be able to function in that space? You know, like with, for instance, with the amount of parking. I know the intention is to have, there's gonna be walkability, but like, people love their cars, and they might not want to walk, so.
You have more control with it being part of the rezoning process because you can make that a agreed upon condition compared to a special use permit. You can't approve it, say, or deny it because, I mean, it could be a theory to be denied because it maybe doesn't meet one of the criteria, but you can't then like implement special, like those are when I say harsh, like any extra conditions for special use permits are supposed to be reasonable. Yeah,
And that is that in the rezoning process or later in the?
well, the way this
approval
is, the
process?
way that I'm proposing it, it could be done either way. Meaning that if they have that detail and they agreed to that condition as part of their rezoning, then that becomes a conditional of their rezoning, meaning any use, like, for example, when Publix got approved at Marvin Gardens, or like the Marvin Gardens conditional district, there's a condition in there that says no deliveries between the hours of like 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Is it enforceable? I mean, yeah, I mean, but at the same time, I received a complaint and got on Publix about it. They then got on their people making the deliveries, making sure it's clear and understandable. Is it gonna happen? Yeah, probably, but it's still, we have then the means to kind of enforce that. So it'd be the kind of the same concept that, you know, the restaurant, and this is just hypothetical, you know, closes at 10. I don't know. I mean, we can kind of put those conditions on there. If they agree to it, then we hold them accountable. If they, let's say they're tavern, or they have somebody come in that, like I said, they were owning the space, but then somebody else comes in and operates it and wants to be open till 12. Well, if it's a violation, like, we can tell them it's 10 p.m. They can come back and then actually go through the amendment process to amend their approval to allow it. Once again, it's a legislative decision. So, I mean, those parameters are in there, and that's why some of that detail is why it's okay if it's going to be approved with that intent of being a restaurant serving alcohol. They don't need to come back and do the second special use because it's a double, what's the term? Yeah, it's redundant.
But, okay, so just to clarify, we can, like, if we miss something in the rezoning, right, we don't think about it because it's, for whatever reason, like, they mentioned maybe live music. Well, live music is great, except if it's out on a patio and it's bouncing off and around, like, you don't necessarily know what the acoustics are gonna be, right? So could we put additional restrictions on, you know, no live music outside after they've already rezoned?
Well, right now, one of those additional requirements already for restaurants serving alcohol says no amplified sound.
Right.
So they still have to comply with those additional regulations in the ordinance. They just don't have to get a special use permit.
That's a lot of regulations in the code.
Yeah, well, you know.
You also have a noise ordinance that they have to comply
Especially if they're not a very
with.
good singer, I don't want to hear them, so,
Yeah.
That's
you know.
her point. It seems like we're pre-authorizing certain conditions to take place, and then if the elements around it change, like the music, what is our recourse?
Well, like, so once again, for this specific example, we already have as a regulation, no amplified sound outside. So are you saying if they do it?
It's just a bad example because it's already
Like I said, the whole reason it was a special use was because if you're giving somebody a blank check to develop their property, that special use was the check, was the check on their, now the check is the conditional rezoning process in itself. If they have that detail, then why should they have to come back and get that redundant kind of approval? Yeah.
I see that perspective, but I still see a pre-authorization. We're like pre-authorizing for them to say, you're gonna have music, and then the element changes, things happen, then we have to go backwards to look at what rules did they break.
Well, that's administrative, that's
Yeah.
that's a violation, that's something that we handle at a staff level.
Okay.
Council sets them, we enforce them.
So, like I said, it's not changing the regulations, it's just changing the process in which they get approved or to carry out. Like, and part of that too is that in certain situations that, I'm trying to think of it, like, you know, if they have a prospective tenant, they get approved for the rezoning, then what happens if, I don't know, council changes over, then you're coming back and getting the special use permit, and then, like I said, it's a more legal process, they don't have as much flexibility that way, but like, if you approve the rezoning knowing that's the intent, then they shouldn't have to come back and do that. But at the same time, if you have somebody that doesn't know what's going to be in there, you still have it as a special use where they have to come back and get that at a later date. Correct. Basically, using the ZEPS of rezoning as an example, if it gets approved in their rezoning / development agreement, we'll probably go ahead and restrict that existing home to be a restaurant with or without alcohol. If they want to change that long-term, let's say for some reason, I don't know, a boutique wants to go in the house. Even though they're doing a commercial kitchen, let's just use a boutique, like, then they would have to come back and amend their conditional zoning. So that's kind of the safeguard that you have in that. Like, once again, you're approving that specific building for that specific use at the time of their rezoning approval. If that changes, there are ways that they have to come back and get that change.
I think my confusion is that when we were setting a lot of these rules out, some of it I felt like we did determine, but then other rules or questions that we had, and correct me if I'm wrong, were going to be determined by the Heritage District, whatever that board was that was going to be doing the signage, and, you know, like, you can't have a sandwich board sign out, and like there were all these like Main Street type rules that had to be followed, and like those were outside of our purview at the time. So like, I feel like we were allowed to make some decisions around things, but then other decisions were being I guess, were waiting to be decided by this future heritage. Do you guys remember that? Heritage
District reported to us.
No. This was like a separate thing that never got created.
Yeah,
They were
but I
like a
mean,
Main Street, like
I
they were.
remember that conversation because you were afraid they would do something, and we were told, no, it has to come back before the planning board, which did, but then
Well,
we
the-
disbanded the Heritage District altogether.
No, that was the strategic committee, but there was
That was on the Heritage District.
there was an additional group.
The intent was to original have a basically heritage design review board, and
It was an additional group outside of the strategic planning committee. No,
No.
it didn't. It didn't ever happen because it wasn't going to happen until the Heritage District actually started to like have businesses in form. There was going to be some sort of Main Street council or something. I don't remember the language. And so my point is that I feel like certain things were being left for them to decide, and then we were making certain decisions, and then they were going to make certain decisions, and they never happened. And
but all those decisions that they would make would all be from an aesthetic standpoint. Has nothing to do with the control of uses. We've already set those standards up in the ordinance.
So what happens if somebody decides, so 5 years from now, we don't want to do a restaurant there, and there's another, whatever they want to put in there, would they have to come back for a special use, or is this a deviation?
This would where they would have to come back and amend their original conditional zoning approval, meaning if that building is locked in to being a restaurant serving alcohol on their approval, and it wants to change, it would have to come back to amend that to allow either for all permitted, I mean, it can be, basically, the simplest way to do it, and this is stuff that we do on an administrative end, is that if it's permitted already in the district as a permitted outright use, then it can go there. If it's one of these uses that are considered a special use or one of these, that additional criteria, I'm not gonna allow somebody to be like, oh, we want all special uses to be a prospective thing. If they have a vision for one of those, it can be locked in. If they wanna change it to one of the, like a gourmet grocery store, I know that the square footage, but like, then they would have to come back and either get a special use permit or amend their conditional zoning to allow that as a use permitted. So- Correct. Correct.
Because the use stays with the property.
Correct. So, we good on that? Like I said, basically, it's not changing the regulations that they have to comply with for those uses. It's just it's taking a step out of the process that it's not needed. And also, it's technically not legal. Like, we can't, if you're having a conditional zoning and you have these special, it's kind of like double jeopardy to an extent.
No, I totally
Is that
get
what
the
it's called?
change. It's just, I think it just makes me nervous approving something in the rezoning process that I think I would need to go back and reread in detail all of the requirements for each of these things, because I've gone through and skimmed them, but
I said, and they still, if you approve it during the rezoning process, they still have to comply with those regulations, meaning for a bar, it talks about litter, it talks about sound and all that, they still have to comply with that regardless.
no, I get that. I'm just saying, I just need to make sure in my own brain that the regulations are going to cover everything. Because I think we all thought that we would have yet another, there'd be one more step after this if we missed something.
But that's also, the rezoning process is a lengthy process anyway, so you still have that step, you still have that chance to induce additional conditions for that use if they're proposing it for that use.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Next change is kind of clarifying in the building or the sub-district categories and stuff. Basically, we had this building size and these ranges for square footage. That really didn't coincide with then when you get into the building type. Like, we discussed this last time. Like, for example, it was cottage commercial. Village house. You know, it talks about building, says size range was 1 to 5,000 square feet. But then in the actual building type stuff that I'll get to here in a sec, it had size range from like 3,000 to 7,000, and you're calling for it to be 2 feet. So it's just trying to be consistent here. So it's basically saying the building footprint size, which would, I'll add probably a little footnote that says footprint is talking about first floor gross area. These are the ranges. It would just be the actual footprint, so it would probably be outside wall to outside wall, unless you, inside. And like I said, this is stuff that we'll kind of hash out, but let me make a note of that. The only footprint. So instead of building size, because this is trying to get this consistency part, instead of having building size, it's the footprint. Yeah. The other change here, see, why is it like flipping like that? Like, here we go. Yeah, it like wants to. So this was also changed in commercial. The other thing that's here is adding the conventional square commercial building type into commercial only. Now, this is like that red farmhouse type looking structure. what I did here is basically adding it as a permitted building type in commercial only, but reducing the footprint size. So in mixed use, the larger tracks, you know, the maximum square foot for that is 15,000 square feet. For here, it's 5 to 10. There's an additional clause when I get to the building type that basically states, in mixed use, it can be a single tenant at 15,000. In commercial at 10,000, it's intended that it's multi-use, meaning that it's multi-tenant. So you're still then controlling what kind of goes into the structure itself based off of that regulation. You're not going to have then a 10,000 square foot building per se. I mean, it would be 5 and 5, but that could be, you know, a grocery store or something like that. Like, it's kind of then regulating the uses on the smaller commercial only properties to be mixed use, but kind of giving them their flexibility of this building type.
Am I reading that right? You're saying on a conventional square commercial that the max is 10,000, but the front setback is 85 feet, the rear setback is 100 feet, and the sides are 50?
The side will be I mean, that's
You're gonna have postage stamp.
the intent to have, the side needs to be, it would be 5 to be consistent with that. The rear setback, it's 100 because it's being consistent with the buffer requirements.
50 is a typo.
Yeah, 50 is a typo, should be 5. In front, once again, I'm taking into consideration the commercial only property, so it's really Robbie, the Crane, and the Zepsa property. 85. That's why it's changing. So, and this is also complying to new buildings. So on the Zepsa property, for example, they have the existing house. So any of their buildings anyway would already be 85 feet back. But it's also it would be 5,000 square feet footprint. Now, it wouldn't be a 10,000 foot footprint building on commercial only. It is, I promise. I mean, if you go 50 by 100, yeah. Because then you're taking in, like I said, for the Zepsa property, for example, their rear property line is the rear. They'd be 5 feet off the side. It doesn't matter how building orientation is. It's where the building, it's where the lot lines are at.
So are you saying, though, because I happen to agree with Michael, because when you say 10,000 square foot building, but are we talking about 5 per
5 and
landing?
5.
So it is, so one landing can only be a maximum of 5,000?
Yeah, the footprint would be maximum 5,000.
Well, what's the 5 to 10,000?
That's the footprint. Well, that just needs to be, yes. That's once again a typo because I copied and pasted. That needs to just be 5,000. It's the maximum footprint size. Yeah. And we don't want that on the commercial only properties anyway. Because that's not the intent of the district. The commercial onlys are this much.
The max you can probably get if you have minimal setbacks is about 11,000 square feet. That's with minimal setbacks, and you have severe setbacks here. So the max, that could be 5,000 max.
Yep, and setbacks, like I said, the intent there is to be 5 on the side, 100 on the rear to comply with buffer requirements for new buildings on the commercial only properties. And the front is, once again, intended for, the front just needs to be dropped back to 50 because that's what the buffer requirement is along major roads. Yeah. So getting into building types, as mentioned, you know, we had the Village House. This was originally 1 to 5,000 square feet. Maximum footprint was 5,000 square feet. However, the height you're calling for it to be 1 to 2.5 acre or 2.5 stories. So basically, it's just raising that size range, and this is not the footprint. This is the total size of the building to 1 to 10,000 square feet, because it's just inconsistent with what the maximum footprint can be. This can be less than 10,000, but it definitely should be more than 5,000. I just did it as 10. We can discuss that, but
I think that the Jones Home project potentially has houses bigger than 5,000 square feet total, didn't they?
yeah, this is for commercial.
oh, this is a village-style house on a commercial
Yeah,
property.
it's the
Okay.
building
Sorry,
type.
Sorry, it's confusing.
It's a shop front.
Yeah. So same thing here.
Can we go, is there a way to say just commercial, because,
It does, detached commercial building.
oh, detached commercial, okay.
And in the,
In that section too, yeah.
yeah, I'll show
Sorry,
you.
it's just hard when we're,
See, it says like village house, commercial uses only,
yep.
same thing. Additionally, cottage commercial, wait, no, cottage commercial didn't change. It was village house and Greek revival. Once again, you're allowing a maximum footprint of 5,000. It's just taking that to 7,000 to 10,000 just to be consistent, because you are calling for this one to be 2 to 2.5 stories. So, and once again, if a conditional zoning comes and they're proposing, 2 5,000 square foot buildings for 10,000 square feet total, and to Mike's point about how it fits on the property, you can always request to be more restrictive, meaning that you can actually make their square foot maximum 8,000 square feet if that's what makes sense. You just can't allow it to go above. And so that's why we're kind of, yes, you're changing it, but at the same time, it's more consistency, and we still have the control if it does not make sense on a property. And final is the well, if it wants to jump, is this. Is the cottage, let me see if I can just zoom out like a tad. Let's see how,
It just does not like.
dude, this is ridiculous. I should have just got my laptop.
Can you just type in the page number that you're, oh,
So, right here, it's just adding size range is up to 10,000, and then it says to 15,000. And the little side note is the building is meant to facilitate limited 10,000 to 15,000 square foot single uses or mixed uses in the commercial only sub-district. So once again, and this, once again, will kind of be reworded for clarification, but the intent here is that if we're allowing this in the commercial only to be a maximum of 10,000 square feet total, still has to comply with the footprint. And so some of that will kind of be clarified. The intent is that if it's commercial only, if it's on a commercial only zone property, that it's for mixed uses, like mixed retail. It's not just one use.
Why would you say it's up to 15,000?
Because the way, I don't want to, the most in commercial only is 10,000.
So you just do a set, you would just split that in half, say up to 10,000 for commercial, only
Yeah.
15,000.
Like I said, there still has to be some wordsmithing that has to go in here for clarification, but the intent is basically commercial only, 10,000 square feet total. The footprint would still be 5,000 for commercial only. And same thing with height, probably bumped up to 2 stories. Once again, this is kind of for the ZEPSA project, because it's just trying to show building type and the use, like it's trying to make it consistent. Because for commercial only properties. Yeah. And it will be, well, it will remain 15,000 square feet if it's on a mixed use property. So, yeah, we'll just, that, once again, wordsmithing for that. Next change is here in the buffer. This one's kind of funny.
This thing's like a computer website, right?
Yeah. Mixed-use commercial, it says again, not directly adjacent to rural residential or suburban residential. There's a clause in the ordinance, if you guys recall, that basically states that if there's a 100-foot strip in between that use, so I'm going to use like 3 Pond Acres and Fincher's property as the example here. If Fincher maintains a 100-foot buffer, that technically buffers the use, so then mixed-use commercial would be adjacent to the buffer, not the rural residential.
so, okay. I know we've talked about this before, but, and I get it being adjacent to the buffer. But if we're talking about rural, so there's no cut vegetation, trees not provided yet, they have to increase the vegetation. But I thought we were still discussing transitional density, so you can't put commercial up against rural, even with a buffer. Like, it could be like if we were using Let's property, straight up commercial in the front, and then with transitional density in between the commercial
Correct.
and the buffer.
And that's,
Meaning like homes, like conservation
yeah.
home.
The problem is if you take Fincher's property and look at how it could be developed, his resident, like, it wouldn't make sense. So what I'm trying to say is, like, I get, once again, this is where that kind of conditional zoning part of it comes in to each property, but for Let's, yes, the intent is to have commercial in the front, residential component in the back. Tim's will be the same way, but the residential component would actually be on the kind of the southern side of his property and not on the side between 3 Pond Acres and himself. So in theory, how you read this, that means Tim can't develop his property at all. So,
In the words of Melinda, how is that our problem? I mean,
no, but what I'm saying is like,
residential property owners were there before this ever existed, so if we are not willing to protect them,
no, but what I'm saying is though too, is that they're,
reasonable, but the people who were there first should get the protection. I mean, if you can come up with something else that makes sense, but like having commercial right up against a rural, just,
and but that's the thing, is
this
you're
was
correct,
supposed
that's
to
not
protect that.
that's not the intent. But the issue is that you're looking at it, if you're saying, if he's rezoning his property for mixed use in the commercial component, saying it's not directly allowed beside, but he's not gonna put houses in the development, like, it doesn't make sense.
You can't, I appreciate what you're saying, but if there's anything, I realized the other day I've had more than 36 meetings here because I've done my 3 years. So I was thinking about that and thinking about the fact that I signed up to do this again for another 36 meetings. And here is the one thing that I've learned. Anybody that's going to be offended and those people online, I'm sorry, please plug your ears. Intent means exactly shit when it comes to doing any of this. Because we can intend all sorts of things, but we have no idea, because we've had lots of conversation of like, well, that wouldn't make sense. Nobody would ever do that. And the next thing you know, we've got all kinds of things happening where that wasn't the intent. So I think that to Kelly's point, what we need to do is make sure that whatever we're putting into place, first and foremost, protects the residents.
Correct.
And that we prevent any misintent or miscommunication that could harm any of the residents. So just, I appreciate what you're saying, but just because it doesn't make sense today doesn't mean it won't make sense in 6 months.
And I also want to clarify, like, I'm not trying to propose these changes to, like, the protection, my goal is still to protect the existing and surrounding properties. But at the same time, based off of how this currently reads, Tim can never come in, even though it's outlined in the land use plan, even though everything else in the vision was for that one little language where it says not directly adjacent means that he can't comply. And this would be one of those that's not really a minor deviation. So the intent is still to provide those protections, but there has to be, if we're still trying to have this heritage district and be successful, there has to be an avenue that he can like propose a site plan, because of the way that reads, he can't. There's just no possible way, unless he did residential, and then there's still some, like, it just like, talking about how like developing the property, all that, like, that's on him to figure out, but that's the biggest thing, is he can't figure it out because of this one little stipulation right here. So I'm not saying that, like, I just have this highlighted right now as a discussion point. I'm not saying it has to change. I'm just saying, like, that is something to consider, because you're kind of taking away potentially that property being developed is what has been kind of the vision of the district.
Yeah, you know, I hear you, and I'm definitely open to exploring solutions, but at the end of the day, there's a property owner who has spent millions of dollars developing their property, and with one stroke, we could come in, allow something to go in and just reduce his I mean, it could destroy his.
But once, the other protection in itself is the rezoning process. Like, that's the thing, is like, right now, it can't even be initiated. It can't start, because there's just no possible way. I'm trying to say is like, we need to look at, or proposing basically revising this to where the protection's still there. That protection then allows the property owner to put together a submittal to be considered, and then that can still be denied. It can still be requested that he increase buffer distances, all of that. There's still protections in place. This isn't, all because this is changing does not mean this is what's gonna happen. It's just providing clarification so a property owner can put together a submittal to come forward with.
I'm actually kind of surprised that the mixed-use commercial also says not allowed to be directly adjacent for suburban residential. But it, just straight up commercial is allowed with a 100-foot tree buffer. Does that make sense? Like, commercial is, the CO, is CO cottage commercial?
No, CO is like, it's basically, and like I said, once again, the big problem with this original chart is it says proposed uses, but yet gets into the actual sub-district classifications, not the actual use itself. Meaning, when you look at the sub-districts, mixed use, commercial, like it says mixed use, like if Tim's property is identified as mixed use, it's saying the commercial component is not directly allowed adjacent, and then it says existing is, and what's the residential component is. So like, he would be able to, in theory, yes, he would be able to put houses, based off of how this reads, 25 feet, they would have a 25-foot buffer between, well, if it's a large lot, you'd have a 25-foot buffer between 3 Pond Acres and the residential lots, that if he proposed 1 acre large lot type homes along that, and then he could have commercial, because then that's like I said, it just does not make sense in a way. Like, why would we want to have maybe, let's just say 10 homes on the right side of his property and then just have commercial? Like, there's no blend because of the way this reads at the current moment. And I have not, this is just once again for discussion. My plan is I've looked at some other ordinances of basically revising this whole table, still taking the same protections and parameters that are there, but clarifying. That's all I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I get it, but I also think this, especially with the rural not allowed to be directly adjacent, the mixed-use section almost doesn't make any sense, because Let's property is zoned mixed use, or it's allowable as mixed use, but it backs up to Meadowlark.
But it also abuts 3 Pond Acres.
Right, so it's got rural all around it. But we were originally talking about, it would be okay if the commercial was in the front, but the higher density residential, or like the transitional density, was in between.
Yeah, and that's still the same intent. It's just like, I'm looking at it from just when, I'm picking on Tim, but if you look at his property, it makes no sense to put residential along that to be the buffer. Like, way his is, it would still be the same. Like, the commercial would be all up front, but you would have parking and maybe some open space and stuff as the actual buffer. But right now, it's stating like that in mixed use, if you are going to be zoned mixed use, you can't have even 100-foot like open space type buffer. It has to, because to the point of the transitional phasing. Like, once again, I'm not saying that buildings are going to be any closer. no. I'm saying that buildings are not gonna be any closer. It's just providing clarification on what the buffer actually is and what it should be to then potentially have something along, once again, Newtown and Waxhaw Marvin Road. Not saying that it's gonna be on the property line of the rural residential.
Is this one of the forms that ultimately
The
company
use.
that we're recessing to come back and talk about on the 30th, are they gonna be reading all of this as well?
What do you mean?
Is,
I mean, are they gonna read it and look over it?
They have.
Okay.
I mean, once again, a lot of these changes have been derived by these applicants in their submittals. Like, certain things were pointed out by their group in trying to get clarification, and I talked to our attorney, and it's like, it's really not clear. There's been certain conversations with Ravi and his team. There's been conversations with Tim. Like, it's a compile of everything, and they reading certain sections of the ordinance and saying, how do we comply to this? How does this, like, work? Because it's not clear. And that's what I'm just trying to do, is provide clarification while we're doing this. Because, like, for example, in the commercial, had a 100-foot tree buffer.
I think, and I know I'm interrupting you, and I apologize for that, but like, I almost think that the mixed-use term is confusing, because it could be residential, it could be commercial. And so it's like, I think that while something might be mixed use, like designated for mixed use, in terms of what goes next to what, it really shouldn't necessarily be mixed use. It should be,
Commercial.
commercial and residential.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean?
That's what I'm saying, is like that's where this chart is taking a set of the use. It's taking the sub-district of the zoning district and trying to compile it with the potential use of that. Like,
But I'll tell you, it doesn't help Fincher.
no.
I mean, it helps lead, but it doesn't help Fincher.
But in a way, and that's just the thing, is it can be interpreted that it doesn't help lead either. I mean, once again, I haven't seen a site plan for lead, don't know, I mean, it just, when you look at it, because I've looked at a lot of buffer matrices and a lot of different ordinances, and there's better ways to go about this and still get better protection out of it. And that's what I'm gonna bring back to you guys on this. Like, once again, we're not making any decisions tonight. I'm just trying to go over what I'm trying to achieve, make sure you guys are in line with some of these recommendations, and then get it formalized for you guys to see. So with this one, like, I'm going to probably redo this whole buffer matrix, mainly because of the mixed use and the commercial, because with the commercial only, for example, it says 100-foot tree buffer. Well, take the Zepsa property, for example. You can take Robbie's property as a prime example, because if you're saying he needs 100 foot along the rear, and then he's got to comply with the 50 feet along a major road, and with it being 100 foot of trees, like, that's not saying parking can be in it, any of that. So my recommendation is take out the tree portion. You still have a minimum of a 25-foot installed landscape buffer. Once again, this is changing the minimum. You can always go more restrictive on their site plan. But basically, the goal is, the other thing that's not really taken into consideration here is there is it varies, it's 25 feet on Robbie's, it's anywhere from 30 to 50 feet along the Crane Store and Zepsa property. There's a HOA reserved common open space vegetated buffer already there. Now, you can say we can include both of them, but that's never going to change. Kind of talking about we don't know what's going on around us. Like, that's dedicated as common open space. It's always going to be common open space. Nothing's going to change that. So that buffer can be in theory, like,
Applied.
yes. It's just, once again, it's kind of, the building itself and the use itself is still going to be a minimum of 100 feet, but it's just allowing for, if it's parking or some type of road network, pedestrian connectivity, to actually be there instead of it being a quote-unquote 100-foot tree buffer.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, and at the same time, I think that these landowners who are zoned, or who are identified as being in the Heritage District, also have to be mindful of their neighbors, and, we shouldn't be putting a restaurant that's not a very deep lot, or a bar or whatever, you know what I mean? Even if there is, if the neighborhood behind it has an additional 25-foot buffer, like, the property needs to almost determine the use.
And it does, I mean, and
So, I mean,
100%.
like, light commercial, I mean, is there anything,
Like I said, the intent here would be to build on this. This will actually be probably more of a complex matrix to get more specific into those uses, because then you are, like, that back building, they didn't say this, but it's been conveyed and was conveyed in the public involvement meeting, that's more of office, professional type space. So stuff from like 9 to 5, nothing like a rush, like a potential, coffee shop, any of that potentially you're gonna have people outside at later hours or any of that. The restaurant and the building closer to the existing, the existing home, like, that would be more of the potential retail, maybe a coffee shop, bakery, something within those use spaces. Because once again, it's kind of then, it's closer to the road, it's further away from the residential properties. It's
I mean,
just
can
how
we
this reads.
create- I know this has already been approved, but since we're having to make changes, can we create something called light commercial that is more like office, 9 to 5 office type spaces?
Yeah, that's kind of what, when I go, like, I've got an example, I know you guys can't see this, but like, I want to say it was in Kannapolis, they have this huge, like, buffer matrix type requirement, and it really gets into clear requirements and what those uses are, and like, you have an aesthetic buffer, you have a semi-opaque buffer, you have a fully opaque buffer. Like, it's kind of getting into that, because once again, the goal is to still have these protections in place, but just make it easier to understand in what's applied.
So the way, are you saying that the way they're doing it is actually the buffers, so there's a minimum buffer just in the whole district, but then the buffer is actually attached to the use and not to the
Not the property itself,
designation?
it's attached to
Yeah.
the use and where it's at to an extent.
I actually kind of like that.
Because also uses change, and especially in some of the, like, so that's where, I mean, it's extra protections, and it's just trying to create some clarification. But the intent is still for the commercial only, like, this is, once again, this isn't fully complete, this is kind of what I've been working on, but it's taking out the word tree, probably adding a thing in there, it's like, it's basically a separation where that building has to be a minimum of 100 feet, it's setback per se. A minimum of a 25-foot installed vegetative buffer. I kind of took the language from like the no-cut opaqueness type thing, where it's like, it needs to be very dense, opaque with plantings for one, screening, but also, like you were talking about, noise reduction, all that stuff. Once again, it's the minimum. It can always be asked that they go more, but it's just not saying that it's 100 feet of trees, because that then doesn't work. It doesn't work on any of the commercial properties.
And therein lies the rub of which properties were determined to be in the district
Any questions?
for your time, though.
Any questions on buffers?
I'll just be interested to see what you come up with.
Yeah, I'll provide a matrix and we can kind of dive into it a little further, either, like I said, in the recess or at the June meeting.
You won't have much time in the recess.
Yeah, I won't have much time during the recess, but I'll potentially go ahead and get you guys that copy.
Just a reminder, Rick needs 2 hours.
Yeah, and then let you guys take it home, discuss it, ask me questions, and my goal is to have some of these, like I said, potentially, if we're all on board with it, a recommendation made at the June meeting. It doesn't have to be, it's just, I want to try to continue moving these forward to, one, go ahead and get in place as we have submittals coming down the pipeline, where they would have to comply with these regulations, but two, like, it's just, this is one thing I just want to get off my plate. So,
We're all looking to get things off our plate here.
but the final change, once again, it deals with open space requirements. it's not reducing the 30% minimum, but there's some language in there, and I don't have this typed out, so I'm just gonna have to kind of explain it. It talks about open space shall be platted with permanent conversation, it shall be deemed publicly accessible, all this stuff. The issue is that we're still gonna require the 30% open space requirement, but when it talks about public access and stuff, that kind of gets into property owners' rights and trespassing and stuff, like, you know, if they were talking about their little pedestrian network within their development, like, it's just basically adding language that it is public, accessible, and dedicated as that to be used by the public during normal business hours. And this is different from then if somebody were to dedicate, you know, let's say like Jones Homes in their submittal dedicated like that 2.5 acres for public park space, like that's different. This is kind of using the pedestrian networks or any type of facilities that are what would be considered public open space or some type of public amenity per the ordinance, just not necessarily that it always has to be accessed by the public, because that kind of gets into a legal terminology. Like, how are we able to allow for the public to always access somebody's property if they're not open? So,
But it also gets on, I have a right to be here and.
yeah.
Yeah.
That was kind of brought up from Suzanne, the attorney for ZEPSA, like, somebody, like if somebody was trespassing and they read the ordinance, well, it's like, well, technically, you're supposed to allow me to be here, even though if they're causing, like, it's just kind of getting into just some legalities part of it. And this was also then identified by our attorney.
It's like semantics, because you're putting up a sign that says no solicitation, but people are still gonna come through there and try to sell you something all day
Yeah.
long. So I don't know if I fully comprehend that.
Well, I'm not trying to say this.
Because I mean, if I'm in an HOA, why would I want to deem my land for public use? It's for the use of my residents.
Correct. And that's basically what the
And that's
change.
what it's supposed to be protecting?
Yes, because right now it's allowing public access at any time. Let me see if I can find the actual.
So if I have tennis courts that aren't gated, you're saying that the public could actually walk on there and use it, or a basketball court?
Not necessarily, it's just certain, it's just their 30%.
What
And
they
it-
deemed as like green
public,
space?
Yeah, but as public, so like the trail that Jones Homes wanted to put around, you know, their property, you know, we don't necessarily, you know, that.
Yeah, that would be,
technically
this would be,
Okay.
But would it be at all hours? Or would that
How
be,
could you
would it
limit
be?
It's the same, I
under
mean-
the Marvin Parks and Rec?
it'd be under the Marvin Parks. I mean, like, we police and monitor our trails currently, and it is for public, but once again, if somebody was trespassing or doing illegal activity on those trails, then we do have a right to ask to remove them, like. So, once again, it's just like, what the intent of here changing, it's not changing the minimum requirements, not changing what they're supposed to do, it's just it's changing the dedication language, because if the entity, like, if you were talking about an HOA, legally, yeah, like, one thing how this reads is like, we're basically asking them, we're trying to take land from them. It's still open space, but it says like it has to be dedicated potentially for public use or the village or whatever. So it'd just be adding like, no, it's still dedicated and always gonna be reserved as open space. And that type of amenity, a prime example of this is on Publix's site plan, or Marvin Gardens site plan. You got Publix, you got that building where like Great Clips and stuff is, and then there's this little like pedestrian plaza. Well, that was counted as like open space or stuff like that. But, you know, if somebody was hanging out there after hours and all that's closed, like, so it's still where, once again, we're getting the preservation we want, but just clarifying really what.
There's still parameters about when it can be used.
Yeah, correct. Other than that, those are the overview of the changes. As mentioned, my plan is to continue working on this. I will bring back, I'll have you guys a copy in your packets and maybe even a printed copy of all this for you guys to review, and we can discuss it further at the June meeting. It sounds like, for the most part, we're good with all the changes outside of the buffer and making sure that's kind of clarified and completely understand. So I'll get working on this. Is there any other questions or comments?
Good luck. It's tough. It's a tough,
That's
It's a
it.
normal process, though. This-
Yeah, it's just,
there's
this is,
just a couple sticky parts that will be interesting
We're
to see what you
smoothing
come
out
up
the
with.
splinters in the woodwork.
yeah, and that's just the thing with how the form-based code, like,
2 months.
when I took it over, and there was just certain things that, once again, was in here from it being a conventional district, and then when we switched it to conditional, like, all that protection's there in itself, and it's just smoothing it over, clarifying.
All right, well, if no one has any other comments or questions, I guess we need to move to recess until May 30th at 6 PM.
Just essentially pausing the meeting until then.
Do we have to make a motion
That
to
is a motion.
recess? So, was that the motion? Did I
It's
just
to
make it?
recess the planning board meeting until Tuesday, May 30th at 6 PM at Marvin Village Hall, 10,000 square feet.
So moved. All in favor? All right,
All right, we'll see you on May 30th.
thank you.